I hope the last session was really engaging. I learned a ton. I hope you guys did as well. I know the idea of building products for emerging markets is maybe something new, so I wanted to actually start off with a short introduction of one, why you should be building for emerging markets, and also two, going a bit into the how. So first, a story why I'm so passionate about emerging markets. When I went to China 15 years ago, I remember at that time, I was so fascinated that this was a market where there were so many hustlers. If you wanted to start a business, your grandma, your mom, she would just start selling something on the side of the street with no license, nothing particular, but that was this hustler entrepreneurial mentality that I've seen across emerging markets. You also go to Thailand, Indonesia, Cambodia, people are selling trinkets, things that they make themselves, and I love this ecosystem in emerging markets, and it's so contagious, and that's why I see a huge potential for these markets. For example, did you know Indonesia is around 200-something million people, the fourth largest country in the world? Brazil itself, also 200 million people. So the population and the market size is there. Okay, a bit about myself. I talked about it before. I have worked on product strategy and marketing through Google, IBM, Rocket Internet, and now building products for the next billion at Facebook. And then, okay. I mentioned the goal of today, or this short session, is to help you understand why we should be developing for emerging markets and how. And I get really excited because when I think about emerging markets, when I'm building a product for emerging markets, I feel like Christopher Columbus. Suddenly, not the colonialism part, not the extortion part, but the part where you're expanding your horizons. Suddenly, you realize there's this new world that you're trying to understand and get depth upon. And this cultural understanding just helps us as humans understand and empathize with the rest of the population. And for businesses, emerging markets are really interesting because one, it's an untapped market. Two, there's large potentials because these markets sometimes are coming online for the first time, so you're their first exposure to an internet product. And then lastly, emerging markets is a playground for new business models, mainly because they're suffering or they are experiencing different problems that you get to build upon and build solutions for. So trivia time. Can anyone guess what percentage of the world lives in emerging markets? So raise your hand if you think 30%. 30, yeah. Okay, raise your hand if you think 70%. Okay, raise your hand if you think 90%. Okay, so we have, I think, 5 people. About 86% of the world lives in emerging markets. That's the majority of the population. That means about, 9 out of 10 people, and that's 6.39 billion people. So just the sheer market size of this opportunity is such a compelling reason why you guys should be thinking emerging market first, global first, etc. Because this is a market that, again, is untapped, but mainly represents your largest opportunity in terms of volume. And especially for companies who are in crowded markets already where it's extremely competitive, emerging markets is a great outlet in order to compete in a new landscape where there might not be an existing player solving for that problem, or there might not be incumbents that hold a large market share. And it allows you to then disrupt the existing ecosystem. So one example that I'll bring up, it's a bank in Brazil called Nubank, and the CEO was asked during an interview, aren't you afraid that the existing banks feel threatened by your presence? And Nubank, they were offering credit cards, I think, for free, and this was unparalleled in all of Brazil. And he was saying, he was extremely excited about the opportunity to provide this new product in Brazil, mainly because the existing status quo was so low that anything he can provide, even if he had to charge them $1 for the credit card, was still better than the existing solutions. So again, emerging markets, they have a lot of legacy technology, and hence if you provide anything that is even a step better, there'll be a ton of people jumping onto the platform. Okay. A lot of people say that a ton of the revenues, money is in developed markets, but we're seeing that shift changing because one, the middle class has always been the consumer class. They're the ones that are going to demand most of the products. And by 2025, there's going to be about 4 billion people that are shifting from poverty to middle income. And as you can guess, most of that people will come from emerging markets. And about 90% of that will actually be coming specifically from Asia Pacific. So East Asia, the Chinas, Japans of the, no, not Japan. East Asia, including China, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, those are really large populations. And of course, and let's not forget South Asia, India, Bangladesh, I think is also top 10 in the country, in the world. About 8 out of the 10 countries in terms of population size, largest populations, are in emerging markets. So we talked about Brazil, we talked about Indonesia, Nigeria is also almost, I think, 100 million. You have Bangladesh, which is also really up there in terms of population. Okay. Another good reason why you should be developing products for emerging markets, high growth. So we talked about smartphone adoption, and some of these countries will skip the laptop computer technology and jump straight to mobile phones. Most of them will. And about the top 10 countries here, you'll see, are also correlated with the largest countries. So Pakistan is another country I didn't mention, also huge in population, but also Bangladesh, which some people don't know that is huge. And about half of the population from the around 700 million folks that are going to adopt new smartphones, again, is going to come from Asia. So if you leave with anything tonight, start thinking or understanding the Asian market, because one, there's huge growth in adoption of hardware devices, but also high engagement on existing products and apps. So for example, Twitter is largely used in Japan, even though in some other markets it's decreased in growth. And for example, TikTok, have you guys heard of TikTok? Okay, well, that was started by a Chinese company and also huge adoption in the Chinese market. So you're seeing a ton of these products having high engagement in these markets, even relatively compared to the developed markets. These people are addicted to their phones. Okay. A lot of people question the digital literacy of those in emerging markets, but this chart, and you don't have to strain your eye to read this, but the TLDR, the takeaway, is that some of these markets are using communications even beyond how developed markets are using it. So in some markets like India, they're using voice first in order to engage with their phone. Because a huge population in places like India are illiterate, they're speaking into their phone to request to use the product. So they would go on YouTube and speak into the phone to say, oh, I want to search for a video of Ariana Grande, and they don't have to type anything. So these technologies that are provided by Google are allowing the next billion users to connect on the internet in ways that are not challenged by their existing barriers, which is, for example, language. Communication in developing markets, they're using voice over IP more than those in developed markets. Where they aren't using as often is email. Thank God for Slack. And for some of the other ones like entertainment, a lot of folks in developing markets are spending most of their time in entertainment and education. And what I'm really excited about is when in emerging markets, they more and more realize that the internet can be used for things like education and information. That's going to be the next wave where they're going to use the internet to increase their GDP by percentage points. Cool. Emerging markets are the ones that are going to be leapfrogging and leading innovation. In Germany, I was just there 4 days ago. I went to a bakery that was like a large chain and they wouldn't take a credit card, which was absolutely ridiculous. Even if you go into the U-Bahn, S-Bahn there in Berlin, they don't take an international credit card unless you download the app. So it's shocking how developing markets are actually leapfrogging developed markets and kind of leaving us in the dust to play catch up. So one example is how revolutionary WeChat. Who has heard of WeChat here? Raise your hand. Okay, still not enough people. You need to travel more. WeChat is the super app in China where it allows you to do anything and everything. Order a car, it allows you to order food, and particularly important, it allows you to pay for anything and everything, not just online bills, but you go to the local mom and pop shop that's selling a donut for $1. They will let you pay over WeChat by just scanning a QR code, and voila, there's your payment. And you see other economies in the Asia region beginning to adopt this more and more. And it's interesting because the countries that are around Asia are really affected by the trends that are coming from Asia. And that's why engagement in those countries are highest, because they see their neighbors, their close by neighbors, adopting a technology that skirts the existing legacy technologies. I talked about M-Pesa in the earlier conversation, so some of you know a bit more about what it is. And that was another huge revolutionary system where it leapfrogged the need for physical banks. So now you don't need banks like Citibank or Danske Bank, Swedbank in these countries. And it's very hard for the large banks to earn revenues from the unbanked because they don't have historical information about them. But you're also targeting a population that has really low savings, and that historical model of a bank just doesn't work for this population. So due to that mismatch, there was room for a new opportunity for new business models, and that's eventually what surfaced. And you're seeing M-Pesa then affect the rest of East Africa. So Uganda, the Rwandas of the world are also adopting mobile payments quickly, and that is also affecting West Africa. So some of the largest economies, Nigeria, Ghana, and some of the smaller Francophone countries are beginning to adopt mobile payments as mobile-first payments. So here I'm showing digital payments growth is led by Asia Pacific, Africa, and LATAM. And the existing today's mobile money penetration is mostly in Africa and Asia Pacific. So these are just generally some statistics to help you understand that around 50% of mobile money is coming from Africa alone, and then another makeup of around 40% is coming from Asia. So you'll see here, well, the US isn't here, but Europe itself is like 1.5%, 1.7%, almost negligible. Okay, this is another interesting example. Who here has money in cryptocurrency? Who here bought it too late and lost money? Okay, that seems like everyone. So, but cryptocurrency has been a trend for the last decade, and you're seeing recent adoption coming from emerging markets, particularly Venezuela and Argentina. So why those countries? Is anyone aware of the situation going on in Venezuela? Yes. What do you think the rate of inflation is there? Can anyone guess? 1 million. Yes, 1 million percentage inflation rate. I've never heard that before. I don't even think it was that bad after the Second World War with Germany. But because of these economic woes and the situation, it has almost forced them to adopt this technology of crypto as the only safe way to store value of money. In Argentina, similar situation. In the last couple of decades, they've suffered political, economic woes, and their current inflation rate is something like 50%. And the young people feel really disillusioned because a lot of Argentinians love traveling abroad. If you've gone to Argentina before, a huge part of their makeup comes from Europe. So if you ask an Argentinian, where are you from? They'll be like, oh, I'm actually Italian, Spanish, and all of this. And hence, they have a huge appetite for traveling abroad. But it makes it very hard if your currency keeps devaluing. And hence, they put their money in cryptocurrency because they know that, one, that is at least predictable, and also that is an internationally accepted form of currency in some of the developed markets they love traveling to. So again, this is another interesting example of emerging markets leapfrogging existing technologies. Okay. People always say in emerging markets, anywhere in the world, there's always copycat models. And I like to challenge that assumption that that's not okay. Instead, I think it's very okay because you have a guarantee that there's a certain business model that has shown that it's worked in a market, and hence you copying that and localizing that sometimes is enough to just build the next unicorn in your company. And you see that all over the world. The current unicorns today are copycats. So for example, in Brazil, I talked about Rappi. It's the Postmates in South America. You have Mercado Libre, which is the Amazon in South America, also a unicorn. The stock price for Mercado Libre on the US stock market is $300-something, and that's much more than what Facebook costs per stock. And you have other companies like Souk in, where are they based? In Dubai for the Middle East, also Ecommerce. And what are some other companies? When I went to Iran, there was a company called Digicolo, also e-commerce. There was a company called Snap, also the Uber of Iran. So time and time again, you're seeing these copycat models succeeding, and I think that's totally okay to do the copycat thing, localize, but that paves the way for the next wave of innovation in these countries to then become the models. So for example, in China, I'm sure, maybe the Alibaba, which is the e-commerce company there, they copied drones from Amazon, but they're going to get to drone delivery much faster than Amazon is, mainly because in these countries, in China, the regulation is either easier, more lax, they're more willing to innovate, whereas in the US, because there's always been this legacy fear of spying around drones, even though the technology exists, it's not going to be brought into consumer hands faster than in places like China. Same things with driverless cars, higher prediction that that's going to go on ground faster in China than it is going to be in the US. I mean, we've talked about the Google driverless car for almost a decade now, and I live in Silicon Valley, and I only still see maybe one test drive car a month. So it's not as frequent as you would imagine. So some new business models, I talked about this earlier. In China, the stationless bikes have also revolutionized the world, and now you see in some countries also a stockpile of these bikes that government officials have been really annoyed by. You see the trends in scooters everywhere taking over as well, and that I think was inspired by the stationless bike concept that originated from China, from Ofo Bike and some other companies. I talked about WeChat and Alibaba's credit scoring program, where they literally take all your social information and whatever information they can find. They aggregate all of that and then give you a score to determine whether you're a good citizen or not. Very controversial, but I do also think this is a really interesting business model that then provides new opportunities for good consumers. So for example, if you have a good score and you go rent a car, instead of paying a $30 deposit, now you pay a $10 deposit. As a person who has a good score on WeChat for a credit score, you're also offered these discounts when you're interacting with other companies. So this transparency in people's consumption and transaction information can be very powerful if you are a consumer that does the right thing. Another company called Branch, they offer microloans to those in emerging markets, and what they do is someone who's interested in a loan would download the Branch app. That app then scrapes a ton of your data, which is like handset details. They would read through your SMS logs, GPS data, and also call logs, and they would aggregate all of that information to then determine your risk profile. They share that information with companies that are willing to give loans, and that gives them an idea of how to assess risk for each individual. And suddenly you have all this economic opportunity to offer the unbanked loans for the first time in history. And suddenly you put these people on the map for the first time in history. And I think this is really powerful, mainly because you're providing an economic opportunity for these folks who were always ignored in society. This bottom of the pyramid suddenly has the same opportunity as you and I. M-Pesa, we talked about again, another new business model, so I won't go into details. Okay, so that was the why you should be developing for emerging markets. And now some case studies on the how. Some of the words are cut off, okay. Just ignore that. Okay, so one framework within Facebook that we always talk about is understand, identify, execute. And the understand portion, one, should take up a large portion of building the product, but two, it should also always be iterative. Someone asked before, how do you jump into an emerging market, think about developing products for an emerging market? My first thing for startups, the easy way to do it, is play around with their existing products. So these are the most famous products in Indonesia. Traveloka, which is the middle, it's the kayak of Indonesia. The first one is Gojek, which is the Uber, but Uber with 1,000 other services. You'll see like Go Food, they do food delivery. They match people who want their houses cleaned and who can provide that. Go Medicine, they allow you to buy movie tickets. And then on the left side, you have Bukla blah, blah, blah. I don't know how to pronounce it, but it is the e-commerce site in Indonesia. And hence, as a startup, if you're really interested about the Indonesian market, because it's 200 million people, you would play around with their existing products, understand the product flows, and understand basically how these existing products engage their users. So when I worked with a startup who was interested in going into a local market, I forgot which market, but what we did was we sat down with the entire team, mapped out, played with 5 different products that were the most famous in that market, and then literally drew out the whole user journey for each of those products, determined where there were pain points for those products, and that suddenly became the inspiration of how we were going to develop a better product than the incumbent. So that's a startup hack. Another one, understanding your user. Spend a day in the life of your user. So we talked about this earlier, and Eugene mentioned that that was where he got the insight and from one of his customers. And just following a typical customer around in a day, you would learn a ton in terms of what are habits, but also understanding what are the existing products they use, how they use those products, what are their pain points. So for example, there was a startup that wanted to launch in Germany, and we followed a typical German businessman around for a day. And we found, and this is a bit obvious, but we realized how important and how aggravating it was. We learned that a definite requirement for a ride-sharing app is a very clear, transparent UI for ETA, which is estimated time of arrival. In Germany, if you don't give them a very clear estimate time of arrival, people will be really frustrated with the app because everyone knows Germans are on time, or at least most of them. And hence, this was a requirement we then put into the product that made it more successful than the other incumbent products. Understanding market trends. Another hack that's easy where you don't have to go spend a ton of money. There's a ton of these social media sites that show you what's trending in the market today. So this is a picture of Twitter trends, Instagram trends, Facebook trends, all of them end up showing the same things. YouTube trends. And this is a good way to understand what people care about in the market today, what news ends up being really important and hits the heart of a consumer, and helps you then build that relationship with the consumer. We were working with a Colombian startup, and they were interested in creating more localized ads for their user base since they were growing. And at that time, does anyone know Harlem Shake? Okay, good. Okay, so you guys aren't totally like left out of the world. No, I'm kidding. So Harlem Shake was a huge thing, and they decided, okay, let's make our own Harlem Shake video, because they were seeing so much virality on all of those videos produced by random people that they decided to create their own for Colombia. And that eventually went viral itself, and that's how people ended up learning about the brand of what they were creating. So that's a way where understanding market trends help you create ads, but also mainly help you form that relationship with a user so that they feel like, oh, this company understands me. They're not just trying to sell me something, but they're trying to sell me a lifestyle. Google Trends is another good product that gives you more macro data. To understand what existing products exist in these markets, general exploring blogs and market research reports. So more value is giving you an idea of what are the most well-known blogs. I remember I went to go search for the best blog in the Middle East, and there was all this noise. But in the Middle East, it's the next web. In Latam, there's something called Latam Tech. And in Asia, your go-to is always Tech in Asia. These are the ones that cover the most amount of news, covers the largest regions. And hence, one, if you're looking for what are the products used there right now, what are the IPOs that are going on there, these are your source of truth. But also, this would be a really good source to find potential partners or potential clients. So for example, if you're trying to go in China and you want to develop some ads format or develop an algorithm for ads, a possible consumer can be their existing ads companies that exist, and you would find some of that information in the Tech in Asia blog. We talked about market research reports. So some of the most well-known aggregators are GSMA. So they have a ton of data around mobile, around smartphone adoption, around the entrepreneurial ecosystems in each of these countries. And they're really well trusted, and they spend a ton of money here. So these are good reports that are for free in these ecosystems. World Economic Forum is another good aggregator. So one specific example, we worked with a startup that was trying to create a product, but one requirement was they needed to operate it in an emerging market that had a high penetration of mobile payments. So that information exists on the GSMA and the World Economic Forum. So we Google searched some of that information, and we helped them come up with a criteria list of these are the 5 countries to launch into first because they have the highest penetration of mobile wallet, mobile money. Okay. Market research is also really important. We had someone talking about that before. And this is more catered towards enterprises. If your company has the budget to create its own research or to buy reports from these large companies, Nielsen is definitely the most well-known, but it's becoming more outdated because most of Nielsen's business was around attribution for TV ads, but they're still really popular. And some of these other names are based out of the UK and developed markets. And usually they can customize reports for you that can provide more accurate data than some of the ones I mentioned earlier. I'm almost through. Okay. Case studies. So I love to talk about existing examples. In the Philippines, people were literally living paycheck to paycheck to the point where everything they buy can only be the amount that would last them for a couple days. So we call this sachet buying or sachet marketing, which a lot of the CPG companies, consumer package companies, they started this trend. You'll see in this picture, this local mom and pop shop, they're selling this style of small packages where you can buy Tide, not a whole. When we go buy Tide, we maybe buy a whole box that has a month's worth of supply or 6 months worth of supply. For these people, they don't have that much disposable income, and hence they need to be buying smaller increments. So hence they buy these small shampoo packets that would last them for one use, small Tide packets. And we worked with a startup who was an e-commerce company, kind of like Amazon, and they also wanted to charge monthly subscriptions. But we advised them that if they did this, the majority of the population wouldn't be able to buy into your product, mainly because we talked again, they don't have that much disposable income. And what we advised them to do was actually charge per transaction, and that netted them out so much more additional revenue than if they had charged a monthly subscription. So again, new business model based on existing products, existing problems in the country. Okay. In Brazil, very interestingly, you can pay for most things in installments. So what that means is if you buy a $150 plane ticket, you can separate that into installments of 6 and pay for it over an entire year. And this is a normal behavior in Brazil. And if you're selling e-commerce, this is something you should be supporting for. So for example, a statistic is that 80% of Brazilians normally pay in installments at an average of 6 payments. So hence, if you're supporting or trying to develop, when we were working with a startup that was trying to expand to Brazil, it was a luxury clothing company. We actually advised them to do installment payments, but also to give the option of installment payments at a higher cost. So for example, if they bought it at one go for 150, and now they're separating into 5 installments, we're charging them like $35 instead. And this helped them, again, gain much more revenue, but also localize the product to allow local Brazilians to afford and opt into using a product. Mobile payments in Kenya. I'll just talk about the specific example. A startup we were working with, again, wanted to offer loans in emerging markets, and they wanted to go into Kenya specifically. So we told them to possibly build an API to capture data from people's M-Pesa transactions and use that information to determine whether someone was creditworthy or not. Because you can imagine the size of the payments that you're sending can determine how much cash flow you have. Also, the frequency of how much you're sending payments determines how liquid some of that cash you have is. So this is really valuable information for people who want to offer loans in emerging markets. Okay. The rest of the flow was things most of you understand as product managers, but building an MVP flow, I emphasize this because product teams tend to overbuild instead of underbuild, and hence in the startups I've worked with, I've always encouraged them to build a really quick MVP, not to necessarily test out by people like using it, but to at least put in front of users, whether that's their own employees or users from a user interview, so that people can react to it and people can start giving real-time feedback, because you can spend so much time in analysis paralysis. Building the product, yeah, the words are cut off. So the basics of building the products, make sure to get this right. I've seen some companies, even ourselves sometimes, screw this up. Things like getting the context of copy, which is language, correct. Sometimes if you screw that up, people don't understand, people are confused, people then drop off. Other things such as doing the QA work before you launch a product. Sometimes developers get really cocky and they're like, no, I don't have any bugs in my platform, but that's never true. So hence, making sure that your whole team sits around a table and does the QA work together, and that way you can build that empathy with users. Of course, building the analytics, making sure you're logging the right events. Otherwise, you build a product and then you don't know how people are using it, where the drop-off rates are. Okay. And then after you launch, you don't just go back to sleep because you've been sleepless for the last months, but analyzing and iterating is the next piece. So making sure after you build the analytics, you're tracking all of that information and understanding, making sense of it. So for example, if you build a product, make sure that you understand each part of the drop-off funnel, or each part of your funnel, from when a user first registers to the very last action you want them to take, whether that's buying something or clicking on something. So making sure you have that funnel very clear, so that when you map that out, people understand that maybe the drop-off rate is 90% at registration, and that tells you have to optimize registration before you even try to optimize other parts of the product. Qualitative, that's the piece of getting in front of users, and when you have a more launch-ready product, sharing that with them and getting their feedback. And then scale. Well, first, find product market fit. And how we define product market fit is when we see retention leveling off. So you can see with the green line, there's no product market fit there, because from day 0 to 20 or week 0 to 20, users end up stop engaging with the app entirely. Whereas for the blue line, you at least see 40% of the users still stay on the app. And that shows that there is product market fit. And sometimes even if there is low product market fit, like you're at 10, 15%, that still shows potential because maybe your initial class of users end up being the users that are first early adopters. And at least there's this pool that you can target and build more of a relationship with and depth with to then increase that engagement over time. Because sometimes you make money off of a small group of users. I mean, you think about brands like Gucci, Armani, Prada, they only need a small subset of the users to be such global and profitable companies. And at the end of the day, it doesn't have to be about volume, but it can be about the margin per customer. And once you've found product market fit and making sure your team understands what that means, then only are you able to scale. And scaling is a whole nother conversation, which we will save for my next visit to Belarus. And that's it. Thank you guys for sitting through this. I think we have about 10 minutes. If people have questions, I'll probably take 2-3 questions. Yes.
The copycats, right? So you've traveled through so many countries. What are some of the examples of the copycats of Facebook you saw, and how would you then approach, I mean, on the emerging markets?
Yeah.
And then how would you approach those markets to introduce Facebook?
Well, definitely the biggest one everyone knows in Russia. What is it? How do you say it? Yeah, I can't pronounce yeah. I think we joked that literally anytime we created a new product feature, they would just copy it and make it a different shade of blue or something. So that's one of the biggest one. And they've succeeded mainly around localization, but also in China, WeChat. But in China, that's an interesting circumstance because, I mean, they took power of the market because the government didn't allow some players in, right? So how we could increase penetration, I mean, it's hard when it's government-wise, but in other markets, definitely doing more localization. But I think for some products, they don't do enough of that. So Uber does really well in that because when they go to a new market, for example, if you go to Indonesia, instead of just cars, they also provide motorbikes. If you go to Vietnam, they show motorbikes as a transportation option as well. So I think we and most other products can do a better job of localization, not with language, but more so providing products that the users are already used to using, and maybe product flows that people are already used to using. Any other questions? Okay.
In the sources of information about brands, you named GSMA or something.
Yeah.
Spell it, so I'll Google it later.
Yeah. Yeah, what about it?
Yeah. Can you just spell it, this source, because it was very tiny, so it was hard to see.
Literally, the acronym is GSMA.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know what it stands for actually, but they have a conference every year called the World Mobile Congress, and it's the largest telco mobile anything conference. Yeah, they're a really credible source.
And then as a question, so you've mentioned that you're working with startups. Are you doing consulting? Is it part of your job, or was it like?
Yeah. So I started an organization called Silicon Valley Abroad about 2.5 years ago. By that time, I was traveling around the world, and I was like, how do I give back somehow? And I love the startup ecosystem in emerging markets, mainly because, again, hustlers, entrepreneurial spirit, and I come from a family who are entrepreneurs. And so on the side, we mentor startups in emerging markets, one, to help them create contacts to connect to VCs in Silicon Valley, two, to help surface startups in emerging markets, because a lot of VC companies in Silicon Valley, they don't even know some countries exist, sorry to say. So let alone that startups exist in those countries. So that's, the thing that I'm working on.
Do you work with Belarus startups?
Not yet, but I've been really, really impressed by some of the startups I've seen here and some of the ones that have gone global that I didn't even know were Belarusian that I've used, like Maps.me, Flow. What is the other one? The Face Mask? No, that one I didn't use. Masquerade, right? That was acquired by Facebook. So I'm very impressed. Yeah. The what? Oh, I don't have that, but I can write it down for you later.
Okay. If we were back to copycats, so for example, in China, WeChat is a kind of copycat and it's a unicorn. What do you think about taking the unicorns of the emerging markets back to the outside world?
Taking the unicorns back to the outside world. As in taking those brands?
Yeah, for example, if we take WeChat,
Yeah.
and try to extend it outside the China or copycat it outside China.
So, I don't know about the copycat portion. No, definitely. I mean, even some of the products we have within Facebook are similar to products in WeChat. But for example, WeChat have expanded into South Africa, and they want to dominate the rest of the Africa region. You have other copycats. The Chinese stationless company that I was talking about, they have copycats all over the world where they first saw the model in China, and now they're producing their own local version. So that's sort of the beauty of what I'm seeing around innovation in emerging markets, that they suddenly become the leaders, and now instead of being known as copycats, they're known as innovating. For example, now a lot of social media companies, even like ourselves, are trying to be a super app where we're trying to provide a ton of service platforms within one app, mainly because we know that people only have so much space in their phone to download another app. And there was like 5 years ago or so, a lot of these companies were trying to create new apps, including LinkedIn. They had like 10 different kinds of different products that they decided to create new apps in. They realized that people weren't downloading those apps, so they decided to condense it all into one or two, right? One for the sales side and one for the consumer side. So trend is people stop downloading apps, so hence you sort of have to put it all into one. In China, there's another company called Meituan, and they take what we have across 5 apps, again, into one app. So we have OpenTable, we have Yelp, and we have some other things to do with small businesses, and they take all of those product features and put it into one app. And that in itself, sure, it's not like the most innovative thing, but they've gotten so much more engagement and efficiency just around this type of model. So. Cool. Last question. If not, you guys are free to have dinner, because I know it's late. Cool, we'll call it. Thank you guys so much for being here today.